and for the introductions. As I said, my name is Macharia, my pronouns are he, him. A couple of ground rules before we get started with the round. Firstly, with regards to time, please keep your own time, unless the panelists would like to put timestamps in the chat. I think everyone can keep their own time. I will indicate when you go above 7 minutes and 15 with a hand signal. Please, that should indicate that we are no longer flowing with you and you should wrap up. The second thing is with regards to POIs. First, please indicate your POI preference prior to your speech. So speakers, respect the preference given by the speaker on the floor. If you want it verbally, visually, or in the chat, please let us know prior to your speech. And yeah, speakers, please follow the method given. Secondly, please take them. They are encouraged. They're good for engagement. And thirdly, with regards to like the POIs, when you do allow someone to ask a POI, please let them ask it. Give them like 10 seconds to do it. Please don't abuse that privilege. Ask one question, keep it short. Yeah, and I'm sure we'll have a very fun and entertaining round. If there's nothing further, I also consent to being streamed, and I guess we can get started with the round. So Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you very much. My speech will be starting in 3, 2, 1. Two things right off the bat to exclude them if opposition wants to run them. Firstly, there's no harm done to the rights of religious people. Freedom of worship still exists. They might disagree with this morally. We don't think it has a lot of impact because metaphysically, even if they think this is sinful, they're not participating in the sin. Therefore, it doesn't implicate their soul, even if the afterlife exists. But secondly, we think that someone disagreeing with a policy is not a reason to ban another policy which provides more inclusivity and more utility. We think that this utility coming from disagreement is smaller than the utility coming from this policy in terms of enabling people to access their identity. More on that later. Secondly, on backlash from religious organizations. First of all, we think it's marginal. Insofar as in Western liberal democracies, a large amount of policies considered sinful in dogma and scripture are already integrated in society. Things like same-sex marriage upheld by the US Supreme Court, things like abortion clinics being funded by Planned Parenthood programs, things like the church being separated from education in laïcité in France. Insofar as the church already believes that governments are going down a sinful path, they're already backlashing against these governments. I don't know what the marginal delta is. It would be the burden of opposition to prove that. But in fact, we think that the opposite happens here. Know that currently we're seeing a pivot of religious organizations towards becoming more congruent with progressive values. These are things like Pope Francis saying, it doesn't matter if you're Catholic, you can access heaven if you are a good person. It doesn't matter if you're LGBTQ because the soul matters to God and not your identity. The rise of moderate mosques who directly claim that they do not represent and they do not support the most radical interpretations of Sharia law. This is happening because churches are aware there's an increasing pivot away from religion in Western liberal democracies. Children who are raised in religious families get into religious dilemmas and crisis of identity very early insofar as they interact with peers, literature, etc., that convinces them not to be religious. Peter, I need a timer because, okay, moving on. This means, therefore, that churches have a strong incentive not to further antagonize the population. This, therefore, means that they do not want to put fence sitters in a position where they believe that the church is necessarily exclusionary, which is to say, these people might believe in God. They might believe in Descartes' deist God, but they do not want to join the church because they think the church is exclusionary. This is where you lose believers. So the church has an incentive not to go against this, but say, we don't care that this policy is passed. We are holier than thou. People should reach God organically, and we're going to convince them to do that instead of being actively opposed to this policy. And I think this is the first benefit we get from the government side. Know that religious organizations have an incentive to retain supporters. First of all, materially, because the more supporters they have, the more influence they have over society. This translates to money and political power. But secondly, spiritually, insofar as most people within the church believe that they have access to the path to salvation, therefore knowledge of the path confers upon you a duty to reveal that path to others, i.e. they want to save the largest amount of souls possible. They want to not behave in a way that's going to get people to relate to these institutions. Not that the radical orthodox people are uncomparative. They think this is sinful anyway. The people who are comparative are people who come into a religious crisis of identity, who doubt whether they want to be part of a religious community because they don't know whether God exists, but even if he does, whether they want to be part of the church. These fence sitters, now that they have this policy, this means that the church knows there's an institutionalized way to reinforce their beliefs away from the church, which means they have an incentive to moderate their beliefs and to moderate some of the rules and restrictions that get people to relate to these institutions in the first place. It's saying things like true believers don't kick their child out of the house because they're gay. As Pope Francis said, true believers are not defined by what they wear. We have less restrictions on things like clothing, on things like chastity. Thirdly, is the idea of saying that we should not force religion upon people in the first place, that the choice to meet God should be your own personal choice and your own personal belief, because insofar as you're forced to meet God, this is not something that is a true belief. This means that insofar as churches moderate their behavior in the most radical ways and they use religious scripture and they use the authority of religious leaders to legitimize this, we say that we're able to limit the excesses encountered by those who who are moderate but live in conservative communities where their identities are limited by things like chastity laws and rules, like their gender identities and so on and so forth. But the same is true for religious parents, because they believe that the Orthodox community is probably the best to raise their children in, insofar as this community has helped them, and they believe that their children are going to lose things if they opt out of this community. As a consequence, they have a pragmatic incentive, even though they don't believe it themselves, to reduce the amount of religious restrictions upon the identity of their children, so that their children don't opt to leave the religion by going to these institutions. But the second thing I want to talk about is that religion is generally hard to opt out of. Three reasons here. First of all, it's imposed on you when you're young. Insofar as you're a child, you don't have developed mental capacities to doubt and consider metaphysical questions. You just believe things because you're told by external authorities. Secondly, if you decide to leave religion later, you have social disapprobation, meaning your parents might disown you. They might tell you, okay, you need not to be religious, but you still need to pretend that you are religious, because otherwise you're a disgrace to the family. But thirdly, and very importantly, there's metaphysical fear. There's always the possibility that you're wrong about the existence of God. If you are wrong, the harm of hell is eternal. And this means that within the belief crisis, you're very often unable to overcome this metaphysical fear. This means that you are deeply unable to reconcile two parts of your identity, and therefore unable to achieve your own definition of happiness, insofar as you have an impulse that pushes you to one side, but you're unable to overcome this impulse because you're unable to overcome the material and spiritual conditions that push you to remain within your current community, but it's also a community you're not satisfied in. Which is to say, first of all, I think there's, insofar as this is important for a dignified life, there is a duty of the state to provide citizens with the capacity to access their own definition of happiness, or at least to try to access it, even if they don't use it in the end. It's independent of the practical, insofar as every citizen equally gives up the rights to the state. But secondly, this just has practical benefits. First of all, as opposed to the alternative, where you have to cut off your community, who is your source of support. You have to seek out like-minded people, but you never know who is like-minded. Your largest source of support is a subreddit that cannot give you actual support. I cannot give you actual material help. We're able to resolve issues for these individuals. We give them a different social circle. We give them connections that can become a support structure in the future, meaning they're better able to leave their community. Secondly, we can allay their fears. We can use religious rhetoric to allay their religious fears. The Pope himself said that if God exists and you're a good person, you're not going to go to hell. So it's okay to experiment with not believing. Thirdly, we can just provide them with mental support. This means at the end of the day, it's easier for individuals who want to leave religion to be able to do this, because they no longer have to rely on the material and social support of their community, which they very often have to rely on, meaning that at the end of the day, even if they don't want to be religious, they have to pretend to be religious and be someone who they are not. The very possibility that we have a larger capacity for people to access their identity, even if they do not, is a net benefit in and of itself. Before I move on, closing opposition.
We think religion gives people many good things like faith, community, and under your description, it also becomes more moderate. So why do we want people to leave religion when it's a good thing to be religious?
I'm not saying I inherently want people to leave religion. So if people believe in religion and it grants them benefits of community, they're likely to want to stay, right? This debate is about individuals who are doubting their faith, or even more, not necessarily doubting their faith, but doubting their community and wanting to leave that community. These are individuals who already don't believe religion is granting them benefits. That's why they want to leave in the first place, non-comparative. Lastly, I just want to say that insofar as this is a government-sponsored policy, it's going to be seen as an anti-radicalization method, right? It's going to be seen as the government taking steps to prevent people from becoming extreme, because it's reaching out to individuals who might be extremized and taking them out of the fold of the religion. Note, I'm not saying that this is what this policy is intended to do. I'm saying that in situations where a large amount of individuals stoked by populists fear the fact that immigrants are coming in to steal our culture and whatever, they want to feel that the government is doing things to protect them. If they don't, they're more likely to engage in things like vigilantism. This is why in Germany, where Angela Merkel said, "Wir schaffen das," all the immigrants can come here, people were vigilantes. They burned down refugee shelters. But in France, where they strictly enforce laïcité and they feel that the government is protecting secularism, therefore there's a lower effect of these people coming in, we have a less incidence of vigilantism, less incidence of violence. This is a latent function of this motion. We have already one for Prime Minister, and Peter still has his speech, so it's going to be fun.
All right, we thank the Prime Minister for that speech. We welcome the leader of opposition to start the case. Yeah.
Right. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Is that a Chelsea shirt again, Macharia?
It's Man City today.
Wow, you went from bad to worse. Shit, this is on stream. Holy shit. Right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The first thing I want to do from opening up is to characterize what RFRs look like. First thing I want to note is that they're likely to be fairly well supported. And the reason for this is that the left wing has shifted in recent years towards being anti-religion as well, in line with their support for LGBTQ and abortion. That means an increasing consumer capacity of the left wing, which as they grow in size, somewhat grow in size, but also people within the left wing, young people become money earners, which means that they have become a richer class of earners that can donate, but also CSR-wise pressure companies to do good for them. Also, the fact that they didn't volunteer within these RFRs, strengthening them in the status quo. Second, note that an individual in a Western liberal democracy today has many other options of access to information, because so many people already reject religion. So many people join movements that are anti-religion and pro-atheism, which means that there is already like in the world of social media, you have easier access to this information than ever before. Third, note that the state already gives them tax breaks the same way they give every other religion tax breaks because they are non-profit. If this is not the case, this will be what we model out, which means that we think that we are treating RFRs the same way as we treat any other religion. One piece of rebuttal first. This vigilantism thing. Are you kidding me? Conservatism in Europe tends to be tied into a conservative way of life and a belief that Muslims are anti that way of life. That is why, for example, Islamophobia is so significant within Europe, which means that I posit being against this religious way of life puts you in line with the left wing rather than being something that the religious right is willing to tolerate. The rest of my responses are integrated in 3 arguments. First, why this is against the principle of Western liberal democracies. Second, why this worsens the state relationship with religion. And third, why this undermines these RFRs that they want to support. First, why this is against the principle of Western liberal democracies. Their claim is that this is marginal. Everything I say will refute this. But the core response is that this is against the entire religion, rather than individual facets of the religion, individual lines within the text, which is what these other policies like abortion laws are. What do Western liberal democracies look like? I posit that Western liberal democracies are against religious intervention in politics rather than religion as a whole for 2 reasons. One, because it's uninclusive to individuals who aren't in that religion and who can never epistemically access the reasons for religious policies that are based on religion. But second, because it's uncertain epistemically and in line with the Enlightenment rationality, it was seen as uncertain epistemically whether God truly exists, and therefore a poor basis to place your decision making. That is why, for example, that is why Western liberal democracy emerged as a balance between the power of religion and the need to be fair and to resist the overwhelming influence of religion that tends to happen because of its supernatural nature. The problem is that this particular policy is in effect a religious intervention as well. And the reason for this is several-fold. The first is that this is equally a claim to supernatural knowledge. When you give talks promoting atheism, you are equally claiming something that cannot be epistemically proven, that God doesn't exist. But secondly, you are invariably proselytizing atheism. This is problematic because insofar as these are both religions, it is morally wrong that we use state money to actively support one, but not support every other religion out there. But second and more pertinently, it is going to be perceived as such. And the reason for that is these principles are only as valuable as people deem them to be, because these conceptions of fairness are ultimately socially constructed at the end of the day. That means that you are going to be perceived as being against these principles of Western liberal democracies. Their claim is that there's a duty to assess happiness. It's unclear to me why the state must fund this. I told you this already. But second, it's unclear why this is more important, right? Like, would you fund minority religion so that people have equal access to that particular minority religion? Because it seems to me to be the same as atheism on that side of the house. The implication of this is that Tin's principle just cannot be actualized in reality on that side of the house. Second, why this worsens the state's relationship with religion. The status quo of Western liberal democracies is one that the capacity to work with, that currently has a limited capacity to work with religion, but attempts to. The reason they're able to do this is because of clear, universally respected boundaries and common conceptions of what society should and shouldn't be, which enable this relationship between religion and the political field to work. What changes on that side? 3 things. The first is that there's a perception of unfair use of tax money that is directly against the core of your belief. And this is different for 2 reasons from particular policies. One, because religion is a supernatural and moral force that is you are rejecting in its entirety. And 2, related to this, the extent of mutual exclusivity. You can still argue on practical grounds for why abortion might be a good thing and say those are more important than the scripture. You can't do that if you're rejecting the scripture in entirety. But second, there is a perception of unfair treatment and unfair benefit that is being given to atheism at the point that tax money is being used for atheism but not others. Third, the narratives that the state is going to attach itself to atheists, the fact that you are perceived as being in line with radical narratives that say that you should attack churches because of the way in which it's likely to be sensationalized by the far right. The claim on that side of the house is that you're already losing, so the religious groups are going to moderate. 4 responses. The first is that this is untrue. See the strength of the right that has gotten the AFD into power, Marine Le Pen as a contender. This is just untrue. Second, the inherent questions, right? like, for example, like the fact that people struggle with capitalism, for example, and see religion as a way out means that the more capitalism continues, the more actually religion may well progress. Third, the fact that this is a chance to create a siege mentality, especially for fringe groups of religion that want to increase their view, their flock, which means that on that side, there's an incentive to push this harder, the more that they say you are losing because you want to fight back. Fourth, note that if this is true, this limits the necessity of this policy anyway, because presumably a lot of other people can give you this support. What is the implication of the fact that religion is going to bend? One, the fact that you lose the ability to negotiate with this religion that we have in the status quo. For example, now we are able to police speech in the immediate aftermath of Charlie Hebdo. We encourage people not to hate on individual abortionists within France, for instance. That changes at a point that religious leaders see you as an opposition and therefore are against you. Note that this progressive shift is uncertain in itself for this exact same reason, because if religion sees itself as under threat from the state, they are less likely to cooperate with the state and do things like vote in prop tenses. The Catholic Church is more likely to vote in a conservative successor, therefore shifting the direction of religion anyway, because they see themselves as under threat. Yes, CG.
Religion is also a subjective epistemic claim, but it imposes itself through coercive mechanisms like the concept of heaven and hell. If people are already looking to leave but cannot because of this, why is there no obligation to help them and protect them from religion?
I've already explained that this is likely to exist in many other ways. I also posit that insofar as people equally feel like without religion, they are going to go to hell and want a religious God, you then have the obligation to fund minority religions. Second, note that this increases the capacity of individuals who want to support religion, i.e. the far right within these areas. And the reason for that is that you increase political support for fundamentalists at the point that you're seen as these people are seen as endorsing religion, but also the right-wing backlash for a lot of people who tend to be conservative, because religious people are statistically more conservative insofar as they tend to follow dogma and think that the old ways are the best insofar as the scripture is similar. That means that in the status quo where the far right is already on the rise, but also in a world where structures are vulnerable and malleable, CF, for example, Trump attacking democratic structures, not just as an analogy, but it's a direct influence to people who think that their way of life is under threat by the increasing presence of Islam, for example, within the West, and therefore feel like they need to react to this by protecting their Christian background within the area. That is what they do is that they attack the structures of Western liberal democracies on that side of the house. The implication of this is that this policy on that end undermines Western liberal democracies, and it's counterproductive because in a world where people don't believe in the value of the Western liberal democracy, or believe that it has been abused first by the left, they are then more likely to push for conservative religion to play a more and more prominent role within the world today. That is why we oppose.
All right, we thank the Leader of Opposition for that speech. We now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to conclude the opening government case. Yeah.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. Grand. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, to know that OO didn't answer the base preemptive that Tin already set up in this debate. That's why he already won this debate from Prime Minister. The perception of religious people stays the same with regards to Backlash, because abortion and same-sex marriage still exist on both sides of the house. These are still things that are antithetic to the baselines of religion, considering that these can be accepted, that they exist within society by religious people in today's standards. It's unclear why this motion is going to be the tipping point that is going to switch people from saying, no, I really don't accept this, but I'm fine with the existence of abortion and same-sex marriage, right? Okay, to their argument about how this is the government claiming epistemic access. This is absolutely untrue. The government is not saying that what we know is right or what we believe is right. It's not even saying that we believe that there isn't a God. We're only saying that we're willing to fund differing opinions, because in the status quo, churches do get tax breaks. These people should get tax breaks. Churches do get funded in the status quo. Most Western liberal governments do give active money to specific churches so that they can get built. We advocate for the same level of commitment to these organizations. Even if the churches didn't get funded in the status quo, and I just totally lied, we are still only giving these organizations equal footing footing, meaning that if this organization has equal footing and we don't know which of them is right, we are leaving people with the maximal possible agency and the maximum possible access to what they believe the epistemic truth is, so they can access what they want, to prioritize their own agency and their own beliefs in this set of values that have been presented with. Cool. Furthermore, that they say, oh, this is against Western liberal democracies because it's anti-democratic. Firstly, this is a circular argument. Secondly, at no point do they show why do we care to the point where this is theoretically against the values of Western liberal democracies when we do get tangible utility, which Tim has brought up within his speech. Lastly, on the point of dissatisfaction, right? They never impact what is the point of somebody being dissatisfied, why the backlash, even if it were to be greater, and we've shown that it's not, is going to be a tangible impact that is going to be relevant within this debate, and why we care for people not liking this being passed. Secondly, somebody is always going to be saddened, and considering that the government has a duty to uphold some median level of agency and to prioritize the agencies of all of its populace, at the point where OO can claim that religious people are going to be dissatisfied, even though it's unclear since they're already dissatisfied, we can also claim that the people on the left are going to be happy because this allows for people to join the ideologies and accept ideologies that they believe are correct, meaning that somebody is going to be dissatisfied and satisfied on both sides of the house, meaning this is generally going to be a wash. And lastly, at the point where we already legalized abortion and say same-sex marriage, it's unclear why this is going to piss people off, because it's not mutually exclusive to have this funded and abortion legalized. It's not going to piss off left-wing people because OG themselves recognize this and agree abortion is already likely going to be legal and funded another way, meaning that we can have both abortion, same-sex marriage, and this funded at the same side, on the same side of the house. We're not having our cake and eating it too. We're saying that this is already existing in the status quo and is already being adequately funded. Now, what Tin has brought to you and why it's already won the debate. Firstly, on the points of backlash that I've already talked about. Next, furthermore, than when OO say, oh, we can negotiate with religious organizations. We're telling you, by their own concession, there is an increase in atheism, meaning that religious organizations are not in a position to negotiate, meaning that this is a bargaining chip. And this is what Tin brings to, and that takes it over opening opposition, because he says that the church has clear incentives to create an environment that to maximize its retention of believers and getting new believers, meaning that it currently has an incentive to advocate for that which is not going to alienate people from religion, meaning that both the church and the parents have an incentive to present religion in a way to their children and to their community in a way that these people are not likely to find it to be a threat, at least not large enough that they're willing to shy away from what they believed in. Note, this is a high barrier to clear, right? For you to abandon everything you believed thus far, this means that this has to be really problematic. This also answers closing POI when they say, oh, but religion is good. Firstly, have fun trying to prove that religion is objectively good. But secondly, consider that these people have already been raised in an environment that makes them believe religion is good, regardless of what the epistemic truth is. This means that at the point where they choose to leave, this means that the religion, or at least, the very least, the religious community was so bad to them that they're willing to cross this huge barrier of forsaking everything they like and everybody they know for the ability to get out of the harms that have been caused to them day in, day out by the religious community itself. Cool, moving on to the points of identity. And I think this is extremely weird that this was totally unresponded to in open opposition, because this is a really big problem. When you are helped, financed, housed, talked to, when you're shown that you can be, that there is a world where you can reconcile these two things, you are more likely to be able to bridge your identity and your religion, both of which form something that you want to have access to. In the status quo, you don't know who you can trust. You don't know who you can rely. You have to go to outside sources like Reddit, like finding random friend groups on Facebook and things like that. You currently, on our side of the house, we can use religious rhetoric to alleviate their stress. To the point of mental support, it is an awful, awful reality to be born both trans and into a Christian family. There is no escape. There is no happiness for you in this life, only potentially in the next one, and that's already hard to achieve. Because if you come out, you're shut away from society. You lose all your friends. You get disowned. Everyone you care about is going to leave you, and you still care about these people, right? Because you have an incentive to seek their approval, and you care about the community, which is your primary mode of socialization. If you don't come out, you're going to have to shut away a part of your identity that you truly believe is essential and the base level of what you actually are, meaning you're unable to pursue all other levels of happiness, because at the base premise of who you are, you're lying every time you're introducing yourself with he, him when you talk to somebody. Before I continue, I'll take closing.
Yes, I think this has a really severe effect on minority communities by causing problems inside the community and cognitive dissonance and making them more closed off.
That's a great segue into what I'm going to talk about next. Within small communities and within minority communities, parents have a belief that their orthodox way of teaching is the right way because this is the way that helped them. Tin already talks about this. I don't know I have to repeat it, but fine. At that point, they likely want their child to experience this to the maximum possible level, considering that they know that there is now a religious rhetoric alternative, that there is now a way to reconcile what they want and what religion says that is not on the orthodox teaching that they believe in. They want their child to not go that path. That's why they're now, for the first time, incentivized to alleviate the stress placed on the child. Saying, yes, maybe you can have a bit of music. Yes, maybe you can stay out a bit later. Maybe I'm not going to be extremely harsh about this because I want you to stay in this at least to some extent because that's a more of a larger option of saving your soul in the future rather than going to a different interpretation of religion, which you find is less correct. And lastly, which is very important because this allows for people to access faith that's not necessarily theistic. You still believe in God and the afterlife, but in a self-defined way, so it can be reconciled with your identity, giving you access to both. For all of the reasons, proud to propose.
All right, we thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. We welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to conclude the OO case and the opening half. Here.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
Yes, I can hear you.
Awesome. POS in the chat, please. Thanks. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 questions. First, do we need their model? Second, how is this model likely to be received by the people that you're trying to reach out to? And third, how does this affect the relationship between religion and the state? So let's start with whether we need their model at all. OG's claim is that religion is hard to opt out of, therefore you need state support. Note that this is not directly responsive to Sean on many layers. He tells you that there's a more progressive society that we're moving towards. There's a lot of left-wing funding that funds these organizations in the status quo. There's likely to be independent sources of funding and outreach. We also already give them tax breaks, just like we do for other NGOs, which means that there's some kind of support that exists on our side of the house as well that is commensurate and congruent or similar to the support that we give religious groups. All of this means, therefore, that their policy is completely unnecessary insofar as religions already, insofar as these groups already are supported in the status quo by either independent bodies or through tax breaks on our side of the house. Their claim is, but religions get money on their side as well. But it's just clearly not true. Right? Look at France, for instance. They don't support any actual religious organization at all. There's no actual mechanism for religious funding. If there was, our principle suggests that it should be taken away anyway. So this is a non-issue in the debate. Given this, OG falls on the principle of why we should fund these groups to begin with. They say there's an obligation towards epistemic access. Here's the first thing I'll point out, that access doesn't mean funding. Allowing something to exist doesn't mean that you have to necessarily use taxpayers' money to support the existence of that thing. Insofar as we already allow the access of these groups and we do not restrict access to these groups in any way, I think epistemic access already exists on our side of the house, given that these alternatives both exist and are well funded by the mechanisms that Sean already tells you about. But second, I think this is the principal response here, is that states don't actually know whether there is a God or not, i.e. the state has an obligation to do something, to not commit to a position insofar as they are unsure as to whether the position might be accurate or not. So insofar as the state does not know whether a God exists or not, it is unclear why they have an obligation to support the position that a God does not exist, and therefore you want to fund specifically these RFR groups vis-a-vis religions themselves. Given this, I suggest to you that's why we should allow for access, but we don't endorse or we don't fund these organizations. This is the same reason why, for instance, political parties may think that their view of the world is correct, but they can't actually use state funds to actualize their particular view of the world. Second question, therefore, how is this likely to be received by the people that you're trying to reach out to? I think the first thing we want to do is characterize these people, because OG does not do that at all, right? Who are these people that we're talking about? They're people who are hurt by religious communities, right? People, for instance, were forced to undergo forced conversion, for instance, which means that they're likely to be extremely distrustful of authority, insofar as a lot of times the people that were in positions of authority were the very same people that were abusing them and the very same people that were enforcing psychological and physical trauma onto these individuals. When the priest tells you that you're going to hell because you are gay, this is an extremely traumatizing experience. But more importantly, insofar as you're a different individual from everybody else and that you don't believe as fervently as the rest of your community, it's also going to be socially alienating, i.e. the structures of power that tell you that you should believe more is likely to also impose a psychological trauma onto you. I think the problem here, therefore, is that these individuals tend to be more anti-establishment and distrustful of authority as a whole. This is especially the case when these individuals believe that religion is tied to the state, i.e. there is a perception within these individuals that there is a strong connection between religious communities and power bases, right? Power bases that control their lives, and that power base often is associated with the state and government that also controls their lives in a similar manner. I.e., I suggest to you that the victim often sees the state as inherently playing a role in the physical or psychological damaging of these individuals, especially if you're talking about the context that OG says, which is that you literally fund the church that is forcing gay conversion therapy onto you to begin with. What this means, therefore, is that the key here is that you undermine RFR at the point of time where you tie RFR to state support. Insofar as these individuals that you're trying to benefit on their side of the house do not trust state authority to begin with and do not trust the ability for the state to help them out, the fact that you are publicizing and tying RFR to these to the specific government that you're talking about in the Western democracy means that you're less likely to get the kind of people that you want with going to these organizations to begin with and getting the help that they need. What is the key weighing here, therefore? Weigh against the principal justification that OG claims, which is that you want to have the most utility possible. I suggest to you that insofar as less people go to these organizations and less people get the kind of help or epistemic access that they need in order to actualize their own identity, what this means is that necessarily OG actually doesn't fulfill the principle better than OO does, which is clearly, therefore, why they lose the weighing comparison. Third question, therefore, on the relationship between religion and the state. Here, I want to suggest that you actually do worsen the relationship between religion and the state. What does OG say? OG says that, oh, but there are lots of other ways that you really fucked up this relationship already. Like, so for instance, like abortion, correct? So, and they said there's no distinction. So let me point out what the key distinction is that was given to you already in Sean. The first important thing is that insofar as you support policies that might be anti-religious, you do not support atheism as a whole. So you create secular, not anti-religious policies. So funding a choice for instance, people being able to access abortion is not a direct attack against religion, because ultimately people who are religious will be able to take up the choice of not going to these groups to begin with. Note, however, that religions care specifically about having followers for lots of reasons, both political, but also because it's literally in their scripture, right? They need more followers within that is literally like part of the scripture that they adhere to. The problem, therefore, with the state's model currently is that it takes people away from religion specifically, i.e., you're actively trying to move people away from religion. It's specifically anti-religious and proselytizing something that's anti-religious in nature, which is why it's likely to be more attacked or be seen as a greater attack on religion versus, for instance, just allowing access to abortion on outside of the house. Before I move on, CG.
The way that OO responds to almost all of the Gov case is to say that the political left and anti-religion forces fund these organizations. Why is there then any change in the perception that people have of them if they're funded by activist leftist people compared to the state, which is at least seen as relatively neutral?
Okay, yeah, because activists tend to be not part of the establishment and not part of the power base that often oppresses these individuals to begin with, i.e., you're more likely to trust them insofar as they are not the very people that control the systems of power that are oppressing you in the first place. So what does all of this mean? I suggest to you that insofar as their model is specifically anti-religious and proselytizes a means of taking people and taking existing followers away from religion, as opposed to abortion laws, for instance, there's likely to be more backlash from the church, who is more likely to be less happy with the uneasy balance between church and state that exists on outside of the house. They want a tipping point. This is it, right? Insofar as it's likely to be seen as a much greater attack than anything else. The consequence here is that it's likely to upset the uneasy balance that currently exists, insofar as religions feel that they are being attacked, and therefore they are probably will step up things like religious lobbying or influence that is already happening in places like America. We do not want that to get worse, insofar as it actually restricts access to abortion in places like Texas, for instance. So all of that means that their side increases the victim mentality of religions, which makes things worse for their side of the house and makes things worse for WLDs in terms of political lobbying. That's why you should stand with OG. Oh, sorry.
All right, we thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech. We now welcome just give me a second, just one.
Please offer POIs in the chat.
All right, member, the floor is yours.
We're going to be running 3 extensions in closing government. Firstly, why there is a huge principled necessity to correct for state historical favoritism of religion over atheism. Secondly, better reasons in OG about why there is still a necessity for this policy amidst the OO characterization of increasing liberalization. And then finally, about uncovering massive degrees of abuse that exist within religious structures. Clash will be integrated. Firstly, let's talk about correcting for historic state bias of religious favoritism. The problem with the opening opposition case is that they are presuming that the state currently operates as a neutral actor between religion and between atheism. This is not correct. For 2 structural reasons, there's been massive state favoritism of religion over secularism. The first reason for this is that historically the church and the state were not removed. They were often integrated institutions that then trickled down into huge degrees of religious influence that permeated into state structures that is difficult to unravel over time. The second thing to say, though, is that there are massive degrees of lobbying from religious organizations that go to the state. The reason being that religious organizations are often well-financed and that they often extract money from their members. Therefore, they function as like a valuable economy of scale organization to help political campaigning overall. Therefore, this has led to a variety of historical and present policies, which literally is a state coercing people to favor religion over other kinds of ideologies. For example, facilitating the creation of large degrees of religious private schools over other kinds of education. Massive displays of religious symbolism within politics overall, things like having crosses in national assemblies. Like you literally have to talk about God in order to remain competitive within US presidential campaigning. The default of going into court is literally making people swear on the Bible overall. It's also the fact that religious norms have often seeped into what could otherwise be secular state institutions. So when the state condoned marriage, the reason why they condoned marriage between a man and a woman for so long, rather than between other genders, is because of how the influence of like religious norms trickled down into what could have been secular state ideology. The weird thing of like religious lobbying is going to increase is like literally status quo. The problem is huge degrees of religious lobbying. The implication of this principle is that historically speaking, the state was morally complicit in coercing people into religious structures, thereby committing the harm or restriction of choice. To preempt the CO case, like it does not matter if religion is good or bad, we do not care. The fact is that the state committed the harm by favoring religion over other kinds of ideologies, restricting the ability of individuals to actually make a choice that was best for them. Given this, I think that states owe a imperative obligation to those who they coerce into religious structures and to the secular community in general for the bias that ultimately existed, which means that there's a necessity for this policy. This is better than the OG principle, which is like the extremely generic claim of states ought maximize freedom, which I think the extension of is like this is a morally nice thing that states could do. We have a far more offensive principle because it's about the state correction of a moral wrong that was already committed. It's not about a moral nicety, but it's about the state creating a form of redress for something that they did historically that was actively immoral. Second, in contribution. Why is there actually a necessity for this policy? I think that opening opposition does something quite clever in this debate, which is a bunch of characterization over how it's increasingly easy for people to leave religions, even absent of these organizations. So things like there's a rise of social media, liberalization is happening a lot, blah, blah, blah. And I don't think that OG is actually super responsive to the nuances of all of the claims that they're making. I want to give a variety of reasons why the current world that we live in is still insufficient in actually enabling individuals to leave. Firstly, the alternative under the status quo that is the largest like atheist movement that is trying to promote people leaving is called the New Atheist Movement. This is a highly radical movement composed of intellectuals like Richard Dawkins and Samuel Harris that take an extremely militant approach in terms of the way that they villainize and they criticize religion overall, effectively claiming it is like an evil societal institution. This deals with the comparative that opening opposition launched these organizations exist under the status quo. Even if they do, which I would posit they might, but probably in smaller numbers, because you don't have the kind of huge economy of scale of state funding who are facilitating the creation of these organizations, opposition from religious structures to new atheism that is literally saying that religious people deserve to burn in hell is always going to be substantially higher than opt into a more benevolent state-sanctioned form of atheism, which is not religion is evil, you must convert. Literally how we are framing this policy is people should have the choices to do whatever they want. If people want to leave religion, and that is their choice. We all ultimately respect that. Therefore, the reason why this alternative though is really harmful, that it also alienates people within religious structures who might not otherwise want to leave. I think that the process of leaving a religion is a very emotionally complex one. You often feel an affinity to the secular self that you want to be, but of course you still have things like emotional and tangible ties to religious community. Therefore, if you have people demonizing religion, demonizing your parents you probably also love, you're going to feel resistance to that. Therefore, we need a more moderate approach to actually get people to leave. Secondly, I think that if people want to leave, the comparative is often them turning to like other people within the religious institutions to try and get forms of advice. So you might ask your friends and family, what ought I do? Given that they were indoctrinated in the same system, they're more likely to not critically evaluate what your preferences are and give you a biased opinion. Whereas given that like people who are employed by the state are not like being paid to be secular, right? Like I think that they can give more impartial advice than people who are literally a part of these organizations. The third thing to say is that these are not only people who are living in the most liberal areas, they're often people who are living in more conservative communities. We agree with OG that there is a general liberalizing influence. This has not reached to like every single person. So we looked at things like Hasidic Jewish communities. These can often have a telephone line to call a state, but they're not massive degrees of usage from social media. These organizations are often uniquely able to permeate these kind of religious communities because they have unique tools in order to like do so. Specifically, people who defected from communities are then able to collaborate with organizations to then explain like the psychological process of other people from their community who might be considering leaving. You can also get things like insiders who might still have some ties to the community and go back and then help facilitate all these processes. This is logically prior to liberalization material from opening government, which is hung on these organizations being hugely effective. We actually established the tipping point of whether they're going to be way more effective under our side of the house, opening up.
Right, Naomi, your entire case is premised on the assumption that you are going to make it easier for people to leave. This assumes that you don't either embolden the religious right to the degree that they control more and more and make it harder, or that you
like I literally explained though that we are better because it's more moderate. Like that is responsive to your case. I also think that the claim of like the religious rights going to get more emboldened is like nonsense. Like radicals are probably going to be radicals under either side of the house because they dislike secular ideology that they perceive as like corrupting religious influence. Finally, let's talk about state abuse. Under the status quo, specifically within the Catholic Church, are often huge crises that exist of abuse. Like brief trigger warning, there are a lot of young boys who are being assaulted under the status quo. There's often forms of assault that occur in like cult-like systems and in radical communities. There are a large degree of corruption that occurs while they're often stealing money from other people, as well as religious radicalism. The state gets far more inside knowledge into these practices under our side of the house. Firstly, when people are leaving, they will often detail why to helpline. So if they say I was assaulted by a priest, the state then gets a baseline level of knowledge. There are actually abuses that are occurring. They know who it is occurring to. They know the precise churches that exist. But secondly, people are more likely to develop an emotional connection to the person who's like helping them exit these communities, therefore enabling them to like divulge more information. So you know the person who like helped you on the helpline, creating a degree of emotional security where you're more likely to confide in all of these people, which means that if someone encourages you to do things like step forward to a prosecutor, you're more likely to agree to that. And in general, just more likely to report things in the first place when you trust state systems, when you're able to help them leave. This makes it easier to, in order to get things like horrible people removed from these institutions, public awareness of what is happening to force institutions to adapt to a better extent, which is better than liberalization, which is admittedly by OG occurring status quo. These are about processes that are far harder to uncover under the status quo. For all of these reasons, I'm very proud to stand in closing government.
Right, we thank the member of government for that speech. We welcome the member of OP to start the CU case. Here.
Hello, am I clearly audible?
Yes.
Water. I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. My framing is going to be about my grandfather, who was a rabbi in 3 different consecutive synagogues that he founded. First an Orthodox one, then a conservative one, and finally a Reformed one. Second thing about my grandfather, that he always said that he does not argue with people who believe in God because he envies them and he does not want to take that away from them. What we're going to talk to you about today is the fact that there are moderate and extreme versions of the religions, the fact that the people who will be receptive to this message are within the moderate religion, and so we're taking a religion away from them, and that the more extreme religions won't be open to this message, and in fact it will create backlash on their behalf towards the rest of society, and internally we'll explain all of that. Okay, so the first thing to understand is that a lot of OG's analysis, tries to go both ways, because OG show that there are some moderate religions and then analyze that there won't be backlash. And not only that, but they will let their kids leave the religion if they want to, and they will still love them because the Pope said we should love everyone and Jesus said we should love everyone. And these people support gay marriage and they support abortions. Okay. We agree that this group exists, but this group exists symmetrically, because in the status quo, if they already believe in those things Tin said they believe in, then they'll enable people to search for information, to be uncertain, and to question. Tin didn't explain why this narrative of acceptance is spread under the notion to further religious groups who don't already believe in it. Now, note also that this group matters the least, because this is the group where it is easiest for people to leave or to question it, because this is a group that does not internalize absoluteness or fundamentalists of religions into people as much. Who won't be receptive to this? Orthodox Jews, recent Muslim migrants, fundamentalists, and evangelists. Note, these people are already opposed to abortion and gay rights laws, right? They protest directly against them, vote against them. Sometimes it's a one-issue vote for these people. They picket around abortion clinics, and it's central to the rhetorics of organizations like Fox News. Why will these people view this as so much worse than those other things, which, as I stated, they already respond to? A, due to the direct targeting. Abortion clinics and afficioners for gay marriage don't advertise in religious centers, they go to atheists. RFRs exclusively have an interest to function in highly religious places and are usually directed at a specific community, i.e. recovery from Orthodox Judaism or recovery from Mormonism, because each experience is unique and each process of questioning is unique. Secondly, because there is a direct attack on God. Note, the other things mentioned are just ignoring a commandment of God. This is directly promoting atheism to people who were taught to believe in the glory of God. See, it is a direct attack on religion and community, starting from the wording, recovery from, as if it's an addiction or a disease, and through the goal to actively decrease the membership of my community. Note that these are often minorities, religious minorities, who already feel persecuted and who specifically fear attempts to decrease the number and cohesion of their groups. D, direct funding is active. That is, the motion suggests that the government actively gives money. Every time I see a new location of RFR or hear of a new person converted from my community, I know that the government actively paid for that, as opposed to the government passively enabling gay marriage, for instance. E, in scale, because these organizations which receive government funding have an interest and an obligation to advertise their success. How many people are they quote unquote helping? But that is viewed by people within those communities as their loved ones who are now going to hell thanks to government funding. Now note, this is where people have a crisis of faith. That was the second point from Prime Minister, not in the moderate religions. This is where people legitimately might believe otherwise, but they aren't sure because they are fearful about putting God aside. They are fearful that they're going to burn in hell, because these are the people who legitimately fear their parents disowning them, their communities ceasing communication with them, per OG's analysis. Now, note, even if these people succeed at leaving their religions and the RFRs encourage that, we don't think that's good, because that means that these people lose their family and community, and we don't think we ever need to push people towards that by actively promoting secularization. If it is important enough to people, they have access to it regardless, but we should never try to push people to cut ties with something unique, because these new circles of talking, this Narcotics Anonymous that is being offered to us by OG is not an alternative to a real family that loves me. But we don't want them to succeed, right? We don't want to push them into narratives of recovery and secularization. We think that there is a far more decent alternative. Those same progressive and moderate religions and branches of religion that I analyzed in the first point and the governments concede exist. Now, why do we think this is a likely alternative? A, because it's a midway point. I can retain my religion, my lifestyles, the beliefs I grew up with, without having to follow extreme principles or practice my religion in a way that I feel is illegitimate. For instance, Reformed Jewish synagogues read the Bible standardly, but they allow female rabbis and they allow Bible books that are written by women. This is important to me when I go to synagogue, and this enables me to do that and still tell my mom, yes, I went to church for the holidays. And secondly, we see this as being the process that happened over time. That is, all of these moderate religions and branches didn't exist 100 years ago. They are already a result of people wanting to continue being within their religion and not recover from it, but to practice it in a more decent and modern way. Now, why is this mutually exclusive? First of all, because they are funding and advertising an alternative narrative to what we're offering. I'll give you in a second, Tim. And secondly, because when I have a crisis of faith, I become moldable and I'm searching for a new compromise. The question is, which new faith will I adopt? Which new compromise? The one they are pushing is bad. Yes, OG.
OO says, and CEO cannot knife, RFR is good. Then, insofar as the state has more capital and organizational synergy than any leftist activist can ever have, there's just more RFR. The clear link for the comparative, and thanks CEO for knifing Top Hat.
Sorry, I'm very sorry, I didn't understand that. You want to repeat it quickly?
Insofar as OO says, RFR
okay.
is...
We're out of time. Sorry, he says we're out of time. Okay, I'm sorry, my partner will answer. Why will there be backlash? Because we think that there are significant harms from this, first of all, within religions, and this is the most important part. Because there is a strong interest for them to retain their people believing in God. And they now have a strong counter narrative, a strong person to fight. They're saying, look at these horrible religions. Everything they teach you is wrong. Everything they stand for is wrong. They will try to convince you to come. They will try to secularize you. They will try to proselytize you. You have to fight them. You have to avoid them. They're likely to be villainized. It is likely that they will be infiltrated into these organizations, as in you send people who don't actually doubt to see who doubts, to talk to those people who doubt and tell them, no, you shouldn't doubt. Stop going to those meetings. Stop allowing yourself to be sucked into this thing that takes away your religion from you. Because we think that religion is at the end of the day a good thing, that we can have people remain in religions, and that when we do this, all we do is push these religions further back and make the situations for people living within these extreme religions worse. Very proud to oppose.
We thank the member of opposition for that speech. We welcome the government whip to conclude the CG case. Here, here.
Can everyone hear me? Awesome. Okay, I'm going to talk about meta debate for 45 seconds. Their CO knifes OO. Here's why. OO says that religion liberalizes, religion has incentives to allow people to leave, and that narratives are broadly becoming better. They also explain that these organizations exist status quo because they are funded by a coalition of broadly left-leaning atheists. In turn, CO argues unique backlash as a result of the fact that religious people are mad that people are being pushed away from religion. They don't give one line of analysis about why the fact that they're mad that the state is doing it is any different from the fact that they're just generically mad about the fact that people are leaving religion. But moreover, the more hardline CO goes on the idea that religion is so conservative and will backlash against anyone leaving is a strong reason to believe that people actually do need this assistance. That there are some people who do have their minds made up that they want to leave religion, but can't because their family begs them not to and threatens to cut them off, and will need to come to terms with that fact. It is CO who wants to cut them off from access to these organizations because they simply cannot attract enough funding in the status quo, even with a coalition of left-wingers who want to fund these organizations. So here's the comparative in the motion. Status quo, some of these organizations exist a lot, but the fact that none of us can arrive at a clear characterization of what they look like implies they are not very mainstream. In this world, the fact that they're funded by private organizations is now combined with state funding. There are more of them. They can really reach more isolated religions and do harder work, in particular religions that are even more conservative and harder to access, which means that more vulnerable groups are reached in our world. This establishes the comparative in the motion. Second of all, I want to note that the only way that OO can win is if we believe a single mechanism, which is there is unique backlash to the fact that the state is choosing to fund these organizations that is unique from any other form of backlash that generically exists to progressive things that the state does, which I think OG effectively argues already. And second, as we add on our side, generic backlash to the fact that these organizations exist and are funded by a coalition of liberals, as LO already concedes. It is not clear to us that this is any significantly worse. Why? Because really conservative religious people are not aggressively tied to like Enlightenment values of liberalism. They're aggressively tied to their religion, which indicates to us that what they care about is people being pushed away from the religion rather than the political philosophy of how it's being done. But I think more broadly, these are people who also believe that the state is secular and won't implement their policies already, which is a strong reason to believe that even if OO has an impact, it does not pass a tipping point. The last thing I want to say is, because there will be more money in this world, even if there is some backlash, so like the most conservative religions now really hate them because there's something unique about the state funding these organizations. The state just has a lot of money and we can fund these organizations more, which implies that even minor backlash from OO is not a very significant argument. So the next thing that I want to do is just to engage on the OO principle. And the reason why OG is insufficient here is twofold. The first is that OG doesn't really respond in a significant way to the OO idea, which probably has some truth to it, that there is a degree of liberalization in society already. But second of all, their only response to the OO principle, which is the state should not endorse views that we don't 100% epistemically know are true, is to give some analysis about how in the status quo, the state favors religion, so we need to do a counterbalancing. Note, this is not the principle that Naomi runs, and it is in fact a far less complex principle than the one that Naomi runs. Their claim is that there's a need to counterbalance, in which case the response is to say, well, the state should simply not give tax breaks to churches. But Naomi's principle is that throughout history, throughout the establishment of religion and the relationship of the state and religion has been endorsed. So the rise of religion and the amount of followers it has and the amount of people who are born into religion is directly enabled by state action. So the solution is not to create countervailing narratives like what OG says. The solution is that rather than a defensive principle on OG, we have an active obligation to remove the religious influence that states actively produce throughout society. This rises to the challenge of the OO principle because OO says we need neutrality and gives good reasons why we need neutrality. OG says, well, we're not neutral in the status quo, so why do neutrality? But that doesn't respond to OO at all. Naomi breaks a deadlock by explaining that the construction of religion and of these attitudes is directly shaped by the state and as a result breaks the deadlock in opening half. I will take CO.
We're fine with RFRs existing for people who actively search for them, but active state funding is what antagonizes extreme religions and massively decreases participation in moderate religions.
I'm sorry, I don't think that the victims of abuse have the time to actively seek out these organizations when they need help right away, nor do I think that the availability of these organizations is sufficient whatsoever for people who are being massively wronged by religion. So I don't think that's enough. The second thing that I then want to address is the OG claim on liberalization. I have two reasons why this OG claim is not important. Number one, OG's own framing about why religion is liberalizing in the status quo when Pope Francis is saying all these good things substantially reduces the impact of their own claim. That is, I believe that their claim leads to liberalization, but they undermine it via their own framing. Therefore, they need other arguments in order to access the benefits of this claim. But second of all, they don't beat OO on this claim, insofar as OO says we agree with liberalization, but that's a reason why not to undermine these organizations, and OG can't rise to that challenge. In what ways does Naomi break this? First of all, she explains why the liberalization claim is just not true enough from OO that we can believe it as a full response. That is, she gives reasons as to why people still really do struggle, can't access these organizations, and there are insulated bubbles that CO talks about where they uniquely need this support from additional funding. But I think the second thing is to explain why there is a uniqueness to the action of the state being involved in these groups. I think that the reason is that there are many victims of genuine abuse in religion. And even though we're not going to expose their names and break their anonymity, the fact that these organizations are being funded by the state means that the state can shape their priorities. What are the priorities of the state? Prosecuting people who are responsible for religious corruption, sexual abuse, and radicalization, which means there's a higher likelihood that we can get counselors encouraging people to go to prosecutors and bring forward information, protecting many future victims. Notably, these impacts are tangible, regardless of what you believe on the narrative of liberalization. It simply will occur as a result of the fact that you have more counselors. People leave religion, but don't say anything because they've had no one to speak through that process and they're deeply traumatized. We help those people come forward and protect future victims. The last thing that I then want to observe on Naomi's extension is the analysis that she gives about the necessity for this policy. She explains why speaking to your friends and family and coming to terms is not sufficient when your friends and family threaten to cut you off. But moreover, she explains that there are unique tools these organizations have, like insiders who were formerly part of the religion and understand the process, who can come back and speak to people. That's why social media and the fact that religion is becoming more progressive, according to OO, is not enough, because these people have so been deeply insulated from those forces. And as a result, you need the unique benefits of these organizations in terms of coming forward. There are just not enough of them on OO, and they're also not seen as credible. The takeaway at the end of the debate is this: there will be these organizations in either world. We have more reach of them, and they can do unique benefits that OG does not significantly prove, but Naomi proves the key link in terms of the necessity of these organizations and in terms of the benefits that they can produce that are not speculative and not undermined by our own framing. As a result, we propose.
All right, we thank the government whip for that speech. We now welcome the opposition whip to conclude the CU case. Here.
Am I visible and audible? Okay, thank you. Okay, so I am beginning in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, I want to address the POI that says we are doing knifing. We think we have to be really nuanced, yes. I think that OG tells us that recovery organizations are just good because they give people autonomy. OO tell, well, they can be good if they don't attack the religion very directly and not perceived by the government. We think privately it can be good. This is the motion of this House believes. We are allowed to give analysis of an angle that says, even if there are no organizations in this world at all, even if there is no private funding, like even if there is the good thing that opening agrees is a good thing, the world is a better place. So this is a legitimate line of analysis. Secondly, we are allowed to analyze why we are okay with this organization, but only if you are the one who does the outreaching and they are not direct missionary. They don't organize events on their own. They don't public stuff. They don't come to these communities and says, okay, in the community center, we now give lecture about why atheism is the right way to life and secularity is good for happiness and being trans is a good thing. We think that if there is no direct attack, that it is better alternative like AI analysis, and this is the legitimate point to analysis. Okay, now I go on and I do one external rebuttal, then clashes. First external rebuttal, we get from CG, it's important to undercover cases of abuse. When people leave, they can tell the abuse and they have emotional connection is good. Okay, we think this is really unnecessary for this thing. Firstly, I think people a lot of time report inside the community, yes? And I think that in the communities have a lot of incentive to take care of cases of abuse because they know if they try to bury it underground, it will come back to bite them later on and they will be punished, the person tried to bury it. Secondly, I think that when person does leave religion, it's really unclear what is the result of the emotional connection he has with the person who helped him and why you don't have emotional connection with just, I don't know, a friend or even person in the police who can be empathetic to you, and the police know how to be empathetic to victims of abuse because they know how hard situation it is. People who were abused, they still have friends in the community, they want to prevent this. They have a lot of incentive to go and prevent the abuses in the future, yes? So we don't think there is any delta. And regarding if more people leave the extreme religion where they're abused, I will clashes directly with AL extension. Okay, now let's talk about why there is backlash and how it affects the community. Because I think we need to do, you need to do characterization here. I think we have two populations. Firstly, we have the population of the moderate, the people we talk about they talk about in OG. We think they're irrelevant, yes, because they're already becoming moderate. And we hear in the speech in OG about how the Pope says it's okay to be LGBTQ. We think that on their side, like you can be practically anything and you're not really suffering in your community. Like on their analysis, my parents let me do anything, all that stuff. But I think there are different communities, more extreme communities, and especially minority communities, which Eyal talks about, which effectively sees it as a direct attack. Why this is a direct attack? I think Eyal gives you a complication of the things that are missing in all. They tell us, firstly, they see it as a direct assault by the state which they already see as someone who is external to them, because a lot of them, they are minority, they are extreme groups, so they are indifferent to them. Secondly, they are trying to take away their people directly. And note how severe this is. When you try to convince someone to not be in your religion, you are condemning him to hell, because if he does not believe your religion, and if he commits sin and not praying to God 3 times a day is sin, he go to hell. His life is ruined, not just this life, but all life, eternal life. This is terrible, terrible thing. So we think, how does this affect the community and this life? We think it is a bad effect for this person, because I think there are two questions in this debate main. The first question is it justified for the country to do it? Is it legitimate? And there's a discussion. I think this is really not important if it's justified. Yes, maybe the country can do it and it's okay, but it depends on the next question. Does it make the life of people better? Because autonomy, even of itself, is not a value that is more important than how are your life going to be. And also, we don't need it for autonomy. Yes, because I think that the Gov bench assumed that you need it. Autonomy is a goal in for itself. But I think, firstly, in liberal democracy, you have social services, you have scholarships, you have support for people who don't have money, yes? So they have ability to do stuff. Secondly, there are still in the cooperative organizations that help you make choices on your own life, like, different religions or just friends or organizations who are not funded but volunteers. So I think you have the basic amount for autonomy. But the question is, important is your life better on when you live? Before I explain why your life is better on if you live on your own and to a moderate religion, yes, opening, please.
Despite overall societal liberalization, this motion is relevant for people from conservative communities told to believe in God. If despite this they want to go to RFR, then religion is already disutile for them, taking down CO, but are also unlikely to be anti-establishment because the state is literally giving them a helping hand to leave the situation, taking down OO.
Thank you. We think that if they want to live, they can search Google how to live. They can do it in a moderate way. They can on their own take these steps. If they don't have money, then you just have help for people without money, unregarded to religion, yes, social security and stuff like that. If they don't have to stay, you have homeless shelter. It's really unclear why you need specific help for these people. If they need emotional support, why it's not enough that they have friends that they can talk to, or to have like forums on the internet to offer emotional support. I think it is better than state support, and we don't need it. So let's talk about why the life is better. Because Eyal and I see something really important. Yes, doing change is traumatic. It is hard to change your life. It is hard to change your basic belief. A lot of the time, I can see things around me and not agree with them. I am a woman. I want also to have a place in the community and feel important. I am gay. I want to have girlfriend. I am, I don't know what. I want to do things that aren't suitable. I want to have more autonomy on my life. Now, if this organization come and talk to me, you can be secular, atheist is good thing, there is likelihood they will convince me. But this might not be a good thing for my life, yes, because I have complete dissonance cognitive. I have extreme psychological harm from losing my faith, from losing my life, which also had good sides, which also had good parts in my life, which gave me community, which gave me tradition, which gave me holidays, which gave me support and security in being with God. I think that on the comparative, there is natural process of religions on itself becoming more moderate, and secondly, people moving between moderate flags. I think all major religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, yes, all of them have several different factions. Yes? As a Jew, I can go to different synagogues. As a Christian, I can go to different churches and have more moderate and have the change on without all of the harms in my life. I think it is better for these people to have this alternative. We don't want the government influence. We think it is bad influence, which causes them to have just worse life in the future and then causes them harms that we do not need in this debate.
Okay, thank you so much.